Can you hear me? Test. Good morning, everyone. Just gonna wait a couple of minutes for everybody to connect to audio. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining this breakout session today. My name is Mandy Hagseth. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Missouri Family Health Council. Our organization is based in Jefferson City, the capital of Missouri, but we have distributed staff across the state. And hello, Brian. I use she, her pronouns, and this is my first time attending a Take Root conference, though I have always admired it from afar. I've just experienced some timing issues or sort of some universal challenges in attending in the past. So I'm just super stoked to be here. And I'm really excited that all of you have chosen this breakout session among the many other very interesting sessions taking place at the same time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Before I do that, I would encourage you all, to the extent that you are able or comfortable, to drop in the chat kind of who you are, or what you do, or maybe what your connection to Medicaid is, just so I have maybe a little bit of additional context in who I'm talking with today. And I would invite you to come off camera to the extent that you are willing and able. You are welcome to make comments or add questions throughout my presentation, but then there will also be additional time at the end to have questions or dialogue. I really, to the extent that we can, I really want to make this interactive. I know that at least a couple of the names that I'm seeing are, have a lot of wisdom in this area. And so today I'll be speaking sort of exclusively to just what transpired in Missouri and just kind of sharing some, FYIs or lessons learned. But you all may have additional information about how this has played out in other states, or just additional wisdom to share. And so I want this to be sort of a brain share and a discussion to the extent that we can through the platform. So yes, please drop in the chat who you are, maybe a little context. Hello, fellow Missourians, Brian and Jess, and I think others. Steph, I think I saw you pop in. Yes, and I would also give an additional plug. Madeline, I see you are here in the room, and I wanted to just draw some additional attention to your presentation tomorrow, which I'm sure is going to be extremely interesting, on Medicaid reform as a vehicle for reproductive justice in the breakout sessions in the morning. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, well, as I said, coming to a state near you, hopefully not, but just in case, make sure that everybody knows what happened in Missouri. We're going to talk about conflating birth control, disqualifying providers, and other attacks on Medicaid. I am Mandy Hegseth. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Missouri Family Health Council. And this is my first time attending the conference. So first, I want to tell everyone about Missouri Family Health Council. We're kind of a well-kept secret, I think, in some ways, and just kind of talk about our role in state legislative advocacy and kind of the space that we occupy as it relates to kind of the national level as well. And then in the orange here, these are kind of the meteor nuggets where the Missouri legislature has creatively attacked Medicaid by way of conflating specifically IUDs and EC to abortifacients, which was the source of a very near catastrophic issue during our regular and also a special legislative session that immediately followed our regular legislative session this year. And then how now there's sort of a continuation. It ran parallel to the conflation issue, but continues on in the provider disqualification realm. And also Medicaid expansion kind of is sort of the envelope to all of this that started and is also going to be the source of some ongoing challenges. And so, of course, I want to share with you sort of what we learned and what you can do about it, but spoiler alert, it's much of what we're all already doing. And so not a lot of, sort of novel ways to push back, except I do really want to emphasize some of the things that if we had more time or known things on an earlier timeline, we of course maybe would have done some things differently. And so want to share a little bit of wisdom with that as well. So Missouri Family Health Council, or MFHC, as you may see throughout some of the other conference materials. Most people here in the state sort of know us exclusively as the Title X Federal Family Planning Grantee, which we are and have been for 40 years this year. This is actually our 40th anniversary. However, a couple of years ago, we also, very excitingly, were able to expand the scope of our work by taking on a privately funded contraceptive equity initiative in the state called The Right Time. And so we are primarily a program service or program administrative organization. We administer through a health center network of 85 clinic sites throughout the state of Missouri, one or both of those programs, Title X or The Right Time. And so our network of health centers is comprised of a variety of clinic types, from community action agencies, county health departments, federally qualified health centers, hospitals, and also standalone family planning clinics, Planned Parenthood clinics, et cetera. And so this is our mission. We are mission driven. And because of administrating these programs, so we ourselves don't do the direct services, they're administered through our network. We have a very small sort of, but burgeoning advocacy and policy sort of division, a mighty team of two, but our executive director also has a very extensive policy background and lends a lot of support in that area as well. So I would encourage you all, and I think it's at the end of the presentation too, just to check out mfhc.org, follow us on social media. We're social, we want to be friends with you all, and reach out anytime, because we have a really interesting line of sight, I think, on some of the issues transpiring on the state level. And then as the Title X grantee for the state of Missouri, we also are a member of the National Reproductive Health, National Family Planning and Reproductive Health Association, or NIFRA, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. There's probably other Title X organizations that may be attending or presenting as well. So what took place in Missouri is fascinating and unique for some reasons. So Missouri has a really, my understanding is it's quite unique in the national scheme. The way that our state Medicaid program is funded in large part comes from this provider tax that's on hospitals and nursing homes. It's called it's a provider tax that we refer to in the state as the federal reimbursement allowance. And so we collect money here. It is matched on the federal level, but at the end of the day, it funds something like 2/3 of between 1/3 and 2/3 of our state Medicaid program. So it's a really vital funding source to operate the state Medicaid program. And what happened was, usually this is like something that happens, it's renewed on, I think mostly an annual basis without controversy or fanfare. But this year, kind of in the middle of the night, it wasn't as late as some of the things that transpire in the Missouri legislature, but on a sort of unassuming evening, a Missouri state senator sought to amend the then FRA, or Federal Reimbursement Allowance bill, with an amendment that he first described as a way to make Missouri, which is a pro-life, in his words, a pro-life state, more pro-life. There wasn't much or any opposition, and the numbers are such in the Missouri Senate that the amendment was adopted seamlessly. So the actual language of the original amendment, this is sort of the amendment that started it all. Excuse me, I'm trying to move some things around on my screen. There we go. Was any drug or device approved by the Federal Food and Drug Administration that may cause the destruction of or prevent the implantation of an unborn child, as defined in some of the other Missouri statute. And so this is problematic for a couple of different reasons, and it was adopted. And so many of us kind of woke up the next morning to alarms being sounded that, have you seen this amendment that was attached to the federal reimbursement allowance? And then many of us kind of scrambling, like, what is the federal reimbursement allowance? We're talking with budget experts and others in the state to understand, like, what is this? What could be the impact? And it really just sort of blew up quite quickly. I will spare some of the turns. It was quite a saga, let me tell you. I'd be happy to dialogue with any of you about the many plot twists in how things transpired in the end. But suffice it to say that while this was going on, of course, the Missouri legislature, like most of the red state attendees at this conference, know that there's pretty much constant attacks on abortion and Planned Parenthood. Missouri is a single provider state, and I know many other states attending this conference are as well, or a single clinic state. I know a couple of other states here are as well. And so there was a provider sort of disqualification piece that was running sort of parallel to this sort of throughout, and a lot of tension within some of the different factions of the Republican supermajority about how this was going to proceed, or how it would be resolved. And so I think that this sort of summarizes things a little bit. Brian and others may recall, this is one of actually sort of my favorite quotes that appeared in the media, because I think that this really sort of said it all. In the beginning, we were sort of, it was unclear sort of if the intent and impact understanding was consistent across the board. Like, was this aimed at taking a swing at IUDs and EC? Like, what was the real intention? How is this, what is the strategy here? But the amendment sponsor, Senator Paul Wieland, who also has been involved in some litigation, kind of a la Hobby Lobby, said in one of the media reports, this quote: "If a device that's been approved by the FDA kills a human life, that is an abortion." I don't know why the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. And so this is kind of, and there's been some additional, I think, coverage and stories about, one in Vogue that comes to mind, about sort of the new attacks on birth control. And I think that this shows that the idea that anything that meddles with conception or fertilization being an abortifacient is not completely new, but it, at least in Missouri, gained some new ground and resonated in ways that were complicated and difficult to message and educate around, especially given the timing and the urgency of this transpiring during a very, aggressive, busy, filled with attack level red legislative session with supermajorities. And so there it is. And there were many different good media pieces, I think, that tried to explain the challenges in, if you are attempting to limit access to abortion, where that starts and stops in relationship to how birth control works and what ends a pregnancy and what prevents a pregnancy. So trying to see if there's anything else to say about the abortifacient discussion. There were a number of different changes to the language throughout both the regular session and also the special legislative session, some that sought to specifically identify like abortifacient drugs, and specifically or explicitly identify abortifacients. In the end, this actually has a good ending, unlike many of the stories that we tell in red state reproductive legislation or anti-reproductive health and rights legislation. In the end, I'm happy to report that the issue was almost entirely resolved. There was a little bit of language that remained in the federal reimbursement bill that passed. However, it restated federal Hyde Amendment oriented law. And so it essentially just said that it excluded actual abortifacients used to terminate a pregnancy. And so where we started and where we ended was pretty significant in terms of what we expected as an outcome. And it did not come easy. And so toward the end here, I'll talk about some of the coalitions, some of the just communication, the use of the media, social and other. And really, this was an issue where our coalition coordination extended. Yes, the sexual and reproductive health community was very connected, but we also worked in a very, very broad, excuse me, we worked in a very broad coalition with budget experts, those that work in greater health advocacy, social service, and other safety net programs. The thing that made this very, very unique in the context of the state work was that such a significant amount of funding was tied to this bill. And there were people who self-identify as anti-abortion or pro-life that understood the gravity of this situation. And even the chair of the Appropriations Committee and kind of the bill sponsor, as it was an appropriations bill, and he really begged this Senator Paul Wieland not to kind of dirty this bill because of the gravity and the magnitude of what it could mean if it was delayed or didn't pass. The sunset on the bill expired in September. And so there was a drop dead on this being renewed. And it became sort of an issue of potentially threatening to destabilize the entirety of the Missouri state budget and all programs dependent on it, not just Medicaid, not just the Department of Health and Human Services or Senior Services here in the state, but also education. All state programs would have been on the line. And so the destabilization of the budget made this such a significant issue, realizing that Missouri is different in its funding scheme, but a broad coalition of health experts and advocacy organizations the state over played a very significant role. Interesting for Missouri Family Health Council was that we, as sort of the Title X and sort of family planning organization with a very small sort of policy and advocacy arm, we often are not sort of leading any of these state level fights. However, in this particular one, and the way that it played out, we were sort of foisted into sort of an accidental front center position of leadership that really required a lot of coordination amongst many other partners, and also trying to sort of figure out how to leverage the education and our health center network to explain and influence the potential policy of this. And so our lane was really sort of called upon, I guess, in this discussion, though, of course, we were working hand in hand with people like Brian, who's here with us today at NARAL, or excuse me, Pro-Choice Missouri, and our friends at Planned Parenthood and Promo and other organizations throughout the state that we were talking with. Seen a couple of things kind of pop into the chat, so I just wanted to check in on that. So Beth, that's a great question. Beth asks, was there a national group that helped to draft this legislation? And is it something that we need to be looking out for in other states? So I have a couple of different language proposals or language that we saw introduced in this presentation. And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. I suspect that, none of this stuff ever kind of happens in a vacuum, and a lot of it is being manufactured at some of these other places. But precisely the title of this presentation, I am a born and raised South Dakotan, coming from a state that often was just like Missouri, a testing ground for kind of new or novel attacks that, if they are first time opportunities, it's not going to be the last time. So I don't know if these have, please share if anybody is aware, both with this and some of the other novel language that we saw. If you are aware that it has happened anywhere else, please let us know. So we were in a lot of dialogue with the National Family Planning and Reproductive Health Association, and Madeline, I know that they too were in conversations with NHELP on some of these things and kind of looking at the national picture. And my understanding from those conversations was that at least the upcoming sort of disqualifying proposed language around the founder of Planned Parenthood, like that has not been done. But I'm always curious if others have information or knowledge of origin or other appearances of some of these things. So I would love to continue talking about that. Yes. So I know that there are people in this presentation that know so much more about disqualifying providers than I do. So please feel free to supplement or correct if needed. So what I have here is, as I mentioned, this ran parallel to our funding kind of anti-EC IUD issue with our federal reimbursement allowance. And this actually was sort of one of the kind of key negotiating chips between members of our conservative factions in the Senate. To what extent were we going to also include a defund of Planned Parenthood in either this or separate legislation? And so, of course, we say that we're disqualifying providers, or we're talking about the qualification and fitness of providers, but in states like Missouri and others, that means Planned Parenthood. So one of the things that appeared, and I'll say, to be clear, this did not pass, but it was alarming in its introduction during the special legislative session that transpired after the federal reimbursement allowance did not pass during, because this is a must pass critical piece of funding legislation. It did not pass during the regular legislative session because of this conflict. There were a couple of different opportunities for resolution that failed, including, I think, the final 2 nights of the regular legislative session. So it did force a special legislative session that started, something like a few weeks, maybe a month at most after, because there was a lot of conversation about needing to understand where the state budget was at by the start of the fiscal year on July 1st. And so while the legislature was kind of taking a second stab at getting this done, there was one area, so there were some of these like clean federal reimbursement bills, allowance bills, and then there were some that had a couple of different, either the language that I had shown in the beginning or some other iteration of that language, because again, we saw several different shades of it with a couple of different tweaks here and there. There were a number of different legislators working on trying to usher in some sort of solution that was agreeable to enough people to pass, but also the big conversation around this became what had legal muster or what could have legal muster. And so this language that on the next slide, my understanding is that it hasn't appeared in other legislation introduced maybe or passed or enacted. But what the goal was here was to sort of supercharge the discrimination provision in federal statute with sort of this kind of crafty founding of Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood, sort of eugenics piece that also kind of co-ops racism in healthcare. So here's what that language looked like. So this basically, the way that it all appeared here, it kind of codifies federal law, but it sort of sneaks in potentially unlawfully these new provider disqualification criterion, which doesn't go to fitness at all. The or was founded by a person who supported eugenics as the solution for racial, political, and social problems, and who advocated for the use of birth control for the elimination of the unfit and stopping the reproduction of the unfit. And so, of course, this was introduced on or by a Republican member of the legislature, and was, I believe, was given a hearing and was discussed. And so, this is, I was trying to think of an analogy for this because, the intentional discrimination in the delivery of healthcare and some of the other elements to disqualifying a provider, like we know are things that we would want in statute. However, the way that they're weaponized is, of course, highly problematic and does not go to actual fitness. And we know it's in a lot of ways aimed at eliminating abortion providers or their affiliates. But it's like taking something good and then putting something, kind of ridiculous on the end of it, or something that's going to be problematic, which, the 1 through 4 are standard. But it's almost like saying something like vaccines are good, but when there's an additional provision on the end that says something like that they also include like a microchip for Bill Gates to allow him to surveil the American populace or something. And so again, this language did not pass, but it was unexpected, and we as advocates had to obviously organize and testify and push back against some of this. And so this just reminded me a lot of the women protective argument in that has origins in South Dakota, where the co-opting of sort of choice and volition is used in statute against reproductive health and rights. And so also I think of note here is that this did not go into effect, but in order for it to have gone into effect, CMS would have had to approve a waiver, which under the Biden administration, of course, they never would have done. So this was a good place where we also collaborated with our national organization to sort of understand, like, has this co-opting of racism in healthcare, has this been done? What does this look like? To sort of understand how others have approached this. And our understanding was that it had not. Thank you, Madeline, for weighing in. And I haven't met Fabiola, but I've heard that she is fantastic. And I know that we know a lot of the same people. So some of the other types of language, that we saw. So this abortion facility or an affiliate or associate thereof language is all over in Missouri statute. And that is also the source of the current debate. So these orange pieces here are included in an emergency rule that went into effect this Wednesday. So after the federal reimbursement allowance was resolved during the special legislative session, and in a way that was unexpectedly positive, at the same time that both chambers announced, or I guess acquiesced in the positive outcome, an interim Senate committee was announced, primarily tasked with continuation of protecting the unborn through the state Medicaid program. It is known as the Senate Interim Committee for Medicaid Accountability and Taxpayer Protection. It convened almost immediately after the special legislative session finished, and sort of looked at two prongs. The first prong was the abortion facility or affiliate or associate thereof. And then just now, they're moving into kind of some other non-reproductive health related kind of transparency and other related items spaces. But their primary charge was to sort of continue this fight to sort of try to eliminate Planned Parenthood from the state Medicaid program. They met swiftly. There was both a meeting with the departments and then also some public testimony. They issued a preliminary report, one of two, or we expect, or they've said that it would be one of two reports. In the first report, they recommended sort of some interdepartmental coordination. So there's a different Medicaid auditing and compliance agency where licensure violation issues would be forwarded immediately to them, so they could assess whether or not they rise to a level of disqualification. And so the orange bullets here were included in the emergency rule that was filed and now has gone into effect. So this is just an emergency rule. We now know that there will be a proposed rule and it could be changed and look different. The only thing that was different from the initial report of the committee to what appeared in the emergency rule was this violations in another state piece. Again, I believe this to be novel, but others may have additional knowledge that similar mechanisms have been employed in other states. But this essentially says that if a violation, I think air quotes are important here, occurs in another state, like a Texas or Arkansas was another one that came up a lot during the legislative session, that if the violation is problematic by Missouri statute and ethics, then it could also serve as disqualifying criteria. And so that did not appear in the emergency rule that has gone into effect, but we do expect that it will either be a component in the proposed rule or in upcoming statutory or legislation that's introduced beginning December into January. So the committee said, this is what we recommend. tightening these bolts in the department and like sort of beefing up the licensure issues and interdepartmental coordination, and also there's violations in another state piece. And then we've seen kind of 3/4 of that appear in the emergency rule that went into effect on Wednesday. And then this process will continue to play out. In fact, on the non-unborn issues, the committee is going to continue to meet next week. So it's like we thought that the federal reimbursement allowance situation was kind of the end. It wasn't again. And then it wasn't again when this interim committee was announced and is continuing to do its work. I'm going to take a quick minute to, I'm a bad multitasker, so me sort of looking at the chat maybe isn't as well done as you will see other presenters do. So Medicaid expansion, I think, is the other piece of this that is just frustrating and fascinating how it's kind of run the entire, throughout the entire issue, because we're talking about birth control in Medicaid, we're talking about funding Medicaid, and then we're also talking about making sure that we are in compliance with federal Medicaid. But let us not forget that Missouri was successful in August in 2020. Missouri became the 38th state to pass Medicaid expansion after what I know many of your states have gone through, like decades-long battles to do this. And also, I think we were the 6th state to do so at the ballot box. And I believe it came shortly after Tennessee. There was another state that we were talking a lot about during our ballot initiative process. But what's important to note here is that the signatures were gathered successfully, and during a global pandemic. Let us not forget, this is August in 2020 when we voted. The deadline for signature submission is escaping me, but it was months before. And the Missouri governor has authority to determine which election a ballot initiative is slated for. So the decision to do so in August, because remember we had a presidential election in November. Now we know the outcome of that, but the thinking was that less turnout, less support, and ensuring the most difficult environment for Medicaid expansion to pass by slating it for the August primary election in Missouri. Nonetheless, it soundly passed. And it did so in form of a constitutional amendment, which I know is not the way that all states have done this. Others have done so by way of amendment, or excuse me, by way of statute. But ours was a constitutional amendment, which does, I think, become kind of more interesting in the context of the legal battle and pushback that then ensued. So passes in August, legislature in Missouri convenes in January. Though the governor did include expansion funding in his proposed budget, first one chamber and then the other refused to allocate funding in the context of the budgeting process during the legislative session. So they refused to fund it. And then the governor said, because the legislature didn't fund it, that he can't implement it because there's no funding source. So of course, litigation commences. This happens quickly, but not quickly enough for the 275,000 Missourians in need of care that would be covered by expanded Medicaid. And I think the interesting thing is that the constitutional amendment, so it became an issue about allocation of funding. That's what the legal battle was about. It only allocated funding, or the argument was that it only allocated funding for regular Medicaid, not the expanded population. That was the source of the legal dispute. And a battle ensues wherein the plaintiffs are arguing that the legislature funded the program. And so the program included the expanded population. but our circuit court said that the amendment was indeed unconstitutional and required explicit appropriation of funds. And then in the end, the state Supreme Court unanimously disagreed and said that's not the case. Yes, it is constitutional. We're going to send it back to the circuit court. And the circuit court then said that it needed immediately to be implemented. However, then the state said, okay, but we're still working on it for 2 months, which some argued was in violation of state and arguably also federal law. And though nothing ever came of that, except additional calls from sort of the plaintiff attorneys and others. But during the legislative session, the surprise was that not only were legislators shirking their constitutional duty, but the voters had spoken on this. So it was kind of a two-prong attack on democracy and the Constitution in ways that were maybe not unbelievable, but very disappointing. And thank you, Missouri State Supreme Court. However, the dragging of the feet was problematic. A queue of applications started, but I'm pleased, I guess, to announce that as of October 1st, so the state had said, well, October 1st, we'll start fully processing applications because they needed additional time to ready the system and to prepare. October 1st, obviously it being the 16th, has come and gone, and the state has begun fully processing newly eligible enrollments. And I believe the last number that I saw was 4,300 new enrollees have been enrolled, but a large queue of application remains with no clear timeline on processing. So Medicaid expansion runs kind of around this entire discussion. And I think also of note, one of the difficulties that we had during the federal reimbursement allowance sort of conundrum was, and I think Madeline or others could speak far more competently to this, but the difference in threshold for coverage of birth control between regular and expanded Medicaid. And so we were eager for a number of reasons, but also eager to understand and know the outcome of Medicaid expansion, and what we even suspected early was going to be litigated because the language appearing in the FRA bill would have almost certainly, was certainly, not almost, was certainly in violation of federal Medicaid law under expanded Medicaid. But there was a lot of debate about regular Medicaid and where those lines were if expansion wasn't confirmed or implemented. And so that's just another, I think, important point that kind of goes throughout this entire Medicaid related sort of legal mess of both challenges and proposed legislation. So what did we learn and what can you do about it? Again, as I sort of teased in the beginning, nothing completely new here. You are all, I'm sure, hugely aware and strong practitioners of coalitions, grassroots mobilization, like all of these things. But I just can't emphasize them enough because, as I said before, it wasn't just a sexual and reproductive health community. It was maybe not even always publicly, but we were in conversations with a lot of other health advocate spaces and got into a lot of other health advocacy spaces that normally we wouldn't. And that allowed and positioned us to have a lot more coordination, a lot of information sharing. And then we were all mobilizing our grassroots at the same time as trying to do as much lawmaker education, working with our allies, trying to find entry points or pressure points for some of the others involved in key decision making. And I do have to just give NIFRA and NHELP another shout out. Like the national and out of state collaboration was huge, specifically with NIFRA, our kind of membership organization. But we were also able to connect with a couple of other contacts through the Title X program in other states, namely Texas, that just lent some additional wisdom and support that was really helpful in some of those key moments. So all of these relationships that we build at conferences like this, and like recognizing people's names and grabbing emails, these are the kinds of things that in these critical moments become so important. Even if it's just a little question like, is this the same language that you guys saw in Arkansas? Like, what did this look like and what advice do you have? A couple of quick calls or connections here and there about some of these things, I think we can really support each other state to state, red state to red state, because we need that support in order to do our best work and continue showing up and fighting these hard fights. And then, of course, the media was pretty good in most of, there were some messaging issues, especially around Planned Parenthood, that can't be denied, but in terms of the education around abortifacients versus preventive birth control methods, LARCs, emergency contraception, I have pretty positive feelings about how most of that transpired. And so keep doing what you're doing is really kind of the takeaway, but lean on support from other states and other advocates that go through similar things. Or if you think something is new, I think that's important, hence us being here, talking about these things like putting new or novel attacks on people's radars, I think can really serve a purpose in the movement. So we can continue to know, some of these creative, different attacks and know how we can respond and maybe even be a little bit aware so we're not always urgently reacting and that it's not the first time we're hearing something, although the creativity never ceases to amaze me. And so that will probably always be the case. Okay, so I'm going to just skip to my final slide and then I'll get out of my screen share. Again, my name is Mandy Hegseth. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Missouri Family Health Council. This is my email address here. Please check us out. I would love to connect with you more. And as others have pointed out, there's all of our mechanisms through the app to stay connected through the conference. I just want to thank Take Root, all attendees, and everyone who does this extremely vital and very difficult and exhausting work every day. Please hang in there. And thank you so much for giving me some of your time today. But I'm going to stop screen sharing. Please feel free to pop questions into the chat, or, we have a fairly small group. I'm happy to invite people to come off mute and make questions or make comments, ask questions, and use the last handful of minutes that we have to have a bit of a state to state dialogue and brain share. But thank you all. Thank you, Beth. Oh, thank you so much, Madeline. So are any of these appearances of language, are you all hearing about anything similar? I'd love to hear some input like, no, this was the first time kind of in this new co-opting racism in healthcare, or, sort of sneakily, but then also maybe very intentionally trying to eliminate IUDs and EC from the state Medicaid program. And Brian, if you're still here with us, if you have anything to add or anything that you would want to say from your perspective, Brian works with Pro-Choice Missouri and was also in close communication with us throughout various twists and turns of all of the aforementioned debates. But Brian, if you have anything you want to add, feel free to come off of mute or pop it in the chat. Beth says, in Kentucky, we expect a Texas-style abortion bill. Yes, so do we here in Missouri in the upcoming session. However, we have not heard anything about the language you have suggested in this presentation, though it terrifies me that Kentucky will pick this up if they hear about it. Yeah, I think the Texas-style ban has sort of eclipsed people's attention and interest. We too have heard similar commitments from legislators to bring some variation of the Texas ban. Also, right now, Missouri has an 8-week, and Brian, you probably can speak to this a little bit better than me, but we have a ban that the Eighth Circuit, this is unusual, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals just requested a full rehearing on a Missouri ban passed in 2019, and just had oral arguments on the reason ban piece. There was one other section to the bill or to the ban. And we are awaiting a decision from the Eighth Circuit on that could also come any day now. So attacks abound at different levels. I think our lane in here in Missouri is largely exclusive to the safety net, and Medicaid is such a critical component of that, that for the sake of kind of our sort of expertise, the FRA piece and sort of going into the provider disqualification into the Medicaid interim committee is kind of where we're focused. But the Eighth Circuit ruling could also have a significantly detrimental effect. Yes, Texas most definitely created a frightening blueprint, and yeah, everybody is excited to do the same. And while it will just be interesting to see how this all plays out, specifically on the timing. And Madeline, you or others might have kind of a strong national picture of the convergence of some of this timing, maybe between the Eighth Circuit here in Missouri, all things Texas, the case awaiting the US Supreme in December. It's, you know, a convergence of many things. And then of course, legislative sessions, the Midwest and red states over are going to be coming up with all kinds of different creative additional assaults that I think we'll be contending with. We have an open US Senate seat here in Missouri with Roy Blunt stepping back, and it is a congested primary. So from the election perspective, it promises to be a very unrelenting and unsympathetic year. Any other questions, comments, food for thought around this or anything else? I'm going to cruise up and read some of the chat intros that I wasn't able to grab at the time that they were happening. Yeah, hi, Jess. Thank you for your comment. The Senate race is absolutely contributing to the nonsense here. The session will be egregious, yes. I'm tired just thinking about it. Oh, thank you so much, both Justine and Steph. Well, feel free to continue to put comments or ask questions for our remaining 6 minutes. It is a very uncommon occurrence for me to end something early. So I feel delighted for the 5 minutes you all might get back. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to be napping a lot over the holidays in preparation. Okay, awesome. Well, you all, I appreciate your time, attention, and encouragement today. Please reach out anytime. I'll just go ahead and drop my email in the chat. And then again, I would just encourage on kind of a more macro level, the presentation, I'm going to pull it up here so I don't botch the title, but Madeline Morcell's presentation tomorrow, Medicaid Reform as a Vehicle for Reproductive Justice, I think would be a really fascinating kind of broader kind of zoom out, look at some of the things that I've maybe laid a little tiny micro level foundation for tomorrow. So thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you, Take Root. Appreciate all you've done. Thanks all.